For this panel, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panelist, Dr. James Galbraith, Professor of Economics at the LBJ School and holder of the Lloyd Benson Jr. Chair, Doctora Eugenia Correa from UNAM, also an economist, and Dr. Rafael Fernandez de Castro, who hails from this university, is a professor at ITAM and the founder of Foreign Affairs Español. The question posed for this panel is inequality and the equality and the effects of NAFTA on both in three countries. It's a pretty simple question, but it's a controversial one that has raised interest in the popular press and in academic circles. I have gathered up some of these treaties, those that are very critical of NAFTA for its effect on equality, those are very positive about NAFTA in general, and those that seem to be in the middle. One writer claims that NAFTA caused, quote, the loss of 1 million net jobs in the United States, growing income inequality, displacement of more than 1 million Mexican campesinos, doubling of desperate immigration from Mexico, downward pressure on US wages, and growing income inequality. Trade and investment trends have even contributed to middle class wage or salary cuts. Subsidized US corn increased under NAFTA, destroying livelihoods of more than 1 million Mexican campesinos. Now, other writers consider NAFTA to have been a series of advantages. For example, NAFTA created the largest trade zone in the world with 450 million people, exporting to each other at a lower cost, increases of the US economy estimated at 0.5% per year on GDP basis, resulting in a 10% real wage increase over the last 20 years. NAFTA eliminated tariffs. Oil prices, food imports are lower. Without NAFTA, US prices for vegetables, chocolate, fresh fruit, and beef would be higher. And there are writers who see both the advantages and the disadvantages. A writer writes, while NAFTA's overall financial impact has been generally positive, it has not lived up to the claims and promises of its proponents. It has made many US companies and investors rich, including their managements. And in Canada, US investment provided higher paying jobs in the automotive, agribusiness, energy, aerospace, and transportation sectors. But it's also cost many US manufacturing jobs, their workers, their livelihoods, while failing to raise living standards in Mexico. Now, we're privileged to have three panelists who have been thinking and writing on these questions for years. So perhaps somewhat unfairly, I went back to see what they have written and said about NAFTA in past years. As early as 10 years ago. Now, in 2007, President Galbraith wrote, quote, trade agreements are predatory. Thus, a main effort of forcing open agricultural markets is to displace small corn and bean farmers from the land, increasing migration. As food moves south, people move north. And he finished this particular essay with the statement, quote, get the fraud out of free trade, end quote. Now, for her part, Professor Eugenia Correa has been skeptical of attributing all bad news to NAFTA. In an article written 6 years ago, she adopted a broader interpretation. Quote, financial and economic instability is intrinsic to the neoliberal economic model. The NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, of course, is part of that model. But it was the neoliberal economic model, including deregulation, global integration, over-indebtedness, that led to the emergence of dominant corporate Mexican corporations, monopolies, foreign control of the banking sector, pushing farmers from the land, and governments needing to use oil income mainly to pay the foreign debt. Her view was that neoliberalism has created in Mexico a subsidiary economy, unquote. Now, on my left, I admitted to him last night that I had a heck of a time finding what he said about NAFTA because he is very protective of intellectual property rights. And his copyrights are very, very tough to break. But his views were summarized in a conference 10 years ago, at the 10th anniversary of NAFTA. He praised NAFTA for being the most significant agreement between the United States and Mexico since 1848. NAFTA represented a change in Mexican attitudes that abandoned overly strict notions of self-determination to recognize the potential of working with its northern neighbors. He noted, however, that Mexicans are now, 10 years ago, becoming disappointed in the continued income disparity within Mexico and the lack of migration accord between Mexico and the United States. That was visionary. Now, have our panelists' views changed over the past decade with additional evidence? We will soon find out. First, I turn to Professor Galbraith.
Thank you very much, Peter. As you have correctly brought to mind, the coming into force of the NAFTA in early 1994 was preceded by a very bitter debate over what the consequences would be, mainly for workers on both sides of the US-Mexican border. There were, from generalized advocates of free trade in principle, glowing predictions of the efficiency and growth benefits of the treaty. There was on the US side, particularly amongst manufacturing interests, a great deal of anxiety about the possible consequences of loss of manufacturing jobs. I think on the Mexican side that there was also a realization, at least in the agricultural sector, that as the protections favoring Mexican maize were phased out, that this would have profound consequences. But on the other side, on the other hand, manufacturing interest in Mexico surely also believed that they would get a very large benefit from the integration of production in the two countries. There was, as Professor Green noted earlier, a general view that this would be the dominant force with respect to immigration, therefore slowing immigration from Mexico to the United States in the wake of NAFTA. And I think the comment that I made, that you quoted from, correctly anticipated that the effect on the agricultural sector would be much more important with respect to migration than the effect on the manufacturing sector. There was also amongst policymakers, and I heard this in Mexico City at the time from very highly placed people, a belief that NAFTA was the only way out for Mexico from the problems that had emerged in the debt crisis of the early 1980s, and that by tying itself in a very tight way, both economically but also politically, to the United States, it would achieve a better bargain from the standpoint of financial stability. And I have to say, on the balance, at the time, as a macroeconomist, that argument seemed to me to be the decisive one. And so I was not amongst those who argued against NAFTA per se on the grounds of the effects on the manufacturing sector in the United States, or for that matter, on the grounds of the effect on the agricultural sector in Mexico. Now, that debate has largely receded, but it is not entirely ended. And you already cited some authors, Mark Wiesbrod, for example, whom I have a high regard for, published an excoriating column just a few days ago on the consequences of NAFTA. But I think a fair evaluation has to acknowledge has to acknowledge basically two things. First, that events of an entirely or largely unpredicted nature that occurred quite rapidly violently in succession following the going into force of NAFTA in 1994 overshadowed its consequences as seen ex ante. And secondly, that the economic theories that were used, that lay behind many people's rather casual assessment of the likely consequences, were shown in the event to have been fairly useless, which is not an unusual development when one lays economic theory up against relevant body of fact. But with respect to events, we had, of course, the uprising in Chiapas, we had the financial crisis and the major devaluation. And then we had, over time, a couple of events at the national and international scale, the rise of the information technology sector in the United States, creating a very substantial boom through the end of the century, which partly through the agency of NAFTA added an advantage to Mexican performance. And then, of course, the accession of China to the WTO and the general rise of China as a supplier of manufacturers to the world and to the Western Hemisphere, which has led to China being described as the uninvited guest at the NAFTA party. I think it's also fair to say that the further consequences, in part of that, which were with respect to the rest of South America, a combination of the rise of China and the collapse of the information technology boom in 2000, led to another, or contributed to another largely unexpected development, which has been called the South American Summer, a decade of low interest rates, relatively high commodity prices, strong demand, deepening democratization and increasing social democracy, including strengthening of social welfare programs, which has led to what has already been noted this morning, a relatively stronger performance in much of the rest of Latin America as compared to Mexico, both with respect to growth and with respect to the decline of poverty. Against this and the economic theories that were prevalent in the early 1990s were largely based upon a Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson or Samuelson-Stolper framework, in which they predicted basically that the increasing trade from instituting a free trade agreement would produce what might produce rising inequality in the richer country as less skilled manufacturing workers lost out. That point was conceded, but were expected to produce declining inequality in the less developed country as their semi-skilled manufacturing sector, which was high wage for them, improved its position and increased its numbers. That prediction had been made in what was a near vacuum of information, and its implications for a broader measure of economic inequality were essentially unknown at that time. People studying inequality as such had very little to go on. They had in the back of their minds the inverted U hypothesis of Simon Kuznets, that predicted that at a certain point, as industrialization proceeded, inequality would tend to decline. Very little evidence outside of a handful of historical cases in already industrialized countries was available. Only by the mid-1990s was there a beginning of an effort to provide systematic information on the measurement of inequality. The World Bank began this in the middle 1990s. This has since been developed by a number of institutions and scholars. And now there is a much larger body of information available to make an assessment about what's happened to inequality, particularly at the household level, than was available then. The problem with that assessment is that the measures are extraordinarily difficult to interpret. And I'm going to give you some illustrations of that momentarily. I'll say a word about the effect of this on my own research efforts, which was to spur myself and a group of my mainly PhD students, but also some others, to seek ways of developing systematic measurements of a consistent concept for income inequality over the world economy over the period that's accessible to us, which is basically the early 1960s to the present. And we have done that by taking advantage of sources of information which other researchers have tended to neglect because they're not based on household surveys, but rather on administrative data. But we've been able to show that they are, in fact, a reasonably effective way of presenting reasonably consistent measures, both across countries and through time. What we have been doing recently is to attempt to assess our own efforts, which are now fairly well developed, and we have measures that go back to the early 1960s and come up to 2008 or so, to assess those measures against the record of the literature prepared by other researchers based upon other sources of information, and to try and come up with, if you like, a synthetic picture of the levels and movements of inequality in a range of countries, of which 3 that are perfectly accessible to us are the 3 members of the NAFTA. So what I want to do now is to show you something, which is, it's always dangerous at a meeting like this to be the first person to use PowerPoint, but I think you will agree that if I didn't have a chart, I would not be able to give you a description that would somehow do justice to this particular diagram. This is a summary prepared by Beatrice Halbach, who is here. Beatrice, why don't you wave? Of the body of economic literature on the measurement of inequality in a relatively small, relatively advanced, relatively disciplined country, namely Canada, about which one would expect this information to be fairly established and reliable. And the 3 different colors, aside from the black, the green, blue, and red, represent 3 different concepts of economic inequality. The green lines are measures of market inequality, that is to say, inequality of incomes earned in the market context. The red represents inequality after taxes and transfers. So you can see a very great differential between those 2 measures. The blue is closer to a gross income concept, so it lies somewhere in the middle. The black line is our estimate of a gross household income inequality measure. Okay, what are you looking at there? You're looking at a vast range of measures that fall between a very low number like 0.27, these are Gini coefficients on a scale of 0 to 1, and a high of somewhere in the 50s for market income inequality. This is actually very characteristic for advanced developed social welfare states because they have large populations with no market income at all, and so their market income measures are extremely unequal, whereas the measures that actually reflect the welfare status of the population after taxes and transfers are relatively egalitarian. And you can also see that there's a pattern in Canada of rising inequality over the entire period on a gentle slope, but no very distinct idea that, let's say, the introduction of a particular event like the NAFTA had a significant effect on that trend. Let's move on to Mexico. Very different picture, as you can see. I think, yes, you can see. What are you looking at there? You're looking at a set of measures which, if one starts after 1982, I think is worth examining. I would ignore the green and the red lines before 1982 as being too irregular and improbable to take seriously, not sufficiently backed up by other evidence. But after 1982, you have a pattern which is common across all the measures. And 2 things emerge from it. One is that there is not a significant distinction between incomes between market incomes and post-tax and transfer incomes. And that is, I think, a very important fact which is characterized by a lot of countries with less well-developed welfare systems. That is to say, you just simply don't have the large populations being supported outside the market economy. So these 2 numbers are 2 sets of numbers, or 3 sets of numbers, are very closely related. And the second interesting thing about these measures, many different measures, is that they all come from the same source except for the black one at the bottom, which is the estimate that we offer from a different body of information. They all come from the state, from ENIGH, the State Household Survey. I've got it. Thirdly, so they're different calculations basically from the same source. Thirdly, There is a rise which goes up to the middle 1990s and a decline thereafter. And if one takes that seriously, I think that's a very interesting fact, but I'm going to argue that it's not perhaps as closely related to the NAFTA as one might immediately surmise. I'll just move on since the time is very short and show you the figures for the United States, which are really quite of a piece with the Canadian figures, the same pattern of dispersion between market and non-market incomes, the same pattern of rise, and the essential inability to discern any perceptible effect in the middle 1990s that might be attributed to NAFTA. Effects in the United States are obviously dominated by the information technology boom and by the real estate and mortgage finance boom in the late 2000s. You can see that very clearly in the estimates, the top blue line there, which gives you, essentially tracks the movement of incomes in the stock market. That is what's driving income inequality in the United States. So certainly for Canada and the United States, income inequality has risen over the entire period. However, the effects of a trade treaty on this with respect to one trading partner in particular are bound to be relatively minor. In the Mexican case, I would simply argue that the pattern that we observe reflects the extraordinarily bad conditions that affected Mexico from 1982 to 1985. Which is to say the vast effect of the third world debt crisis, the depreciation of the peso on several occasions, which has the effect of creating a dispersion of incomes between those involved in export manufacturing activities and those not so involved, and that the consequences afterwards represent, to the extent that they are meaningful, represent real information, which is a debatable proposition and people do debate it, they are largely indicative of the modest stabilization that occurred after the mid-1990s, thereby to some extent, and I'll come back around to where I stood at the beginning, to some extent vindicating the judgment of the policymakers in Mexico who favored NAFTA on the ground that it would tie Mexico's fortunes, for better or worse, to the United States and end a cycle of, let's say, financial rejectionism which had afflicted the country in the previous period. The problem, of course, with that is who guards the guardians. At the end of the day, it was the United States itself that became engulfed in a major financial disaster, which has had, I think, and will have lasting consequences for our ability to resume growth. Doug Massey already mentioned about the construction sector. And given the integration that now exists between the two countries, Mexico is stuck, as other countries of Latin America and South America are not. Its fate is basically tied to the management or mismanagement of the American economy going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Galbraith. Now we'll turn to Doctora Eugenia Correa.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. Especially, I'm very grateful with Peter Worm, Victoria Rodriguez, and James Galbraith for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here today with you. Yes, I'm in a position in which you can say that I'm always a very strong critics person against the NAFTA, since before the NAFTA birth, and even and participate a lot of discussion about what could happen with the NAFTA, and I must say that I discussed what can happen with the NAFTA in financial sector, and everybody that we say at that time that will happen really happened. But now, 20 years after, I have more, of course, more knowledge about what happened, and of course my position is more, how do you say, well-informed, especially because all that happened with this migration and with this social politics that we have in Mexico right now. Then I know that it is important to start with a joke, as always. But this time I think that it is difficult to have a smile for you to have a laugh. Then I think that probably most of you read in Spanish and you can smile with these words of, I don't know if you remember, but it is a diva of the Mexican films, that is Maria Felix. Yes, I think that most of you remember Maria Felix, and let me show you the words of Maria Felix about the NAFTA. Yes, and I'm really, it is hard for me to recognize that it is true. Right? I don't know if NAFTA directly created that, but it is true that in Mexico City is full of these Mexican people selling tacos and fritangas in our very beautiful city. Then, it is not only the problem in the border, it is not only the problem in Tijuana, it is all our country that have a huge, very deeply problems in economic and social issues that we need to resolve, of course, but not alone, because right now we have a strong partners. I need to see, probably it is hard for you to follow a lot of data right now, but it is important to know which kind of country start with the NAFTA, and the gap that exists previously the NAFTA, the gap of development between United States and Mexico, between Canada, United States and Mexico, was so deeply, and unfortunately the NAFTA couldn't help really to at least stop or at least make some bridge for convergence. Then you can see, well, the rate of poverty, the winner data are the foreign trade, of course, the capital inflows, the capital outflows, but the public expenditure ratio, for example, or the net saving, the net saving rate ratio, every single indicator of the Mexican economy go down. Not only, of course, because of NAFTA. And if you want to see what happened in those 20 years, just look in the work and the work world, you can see this data that it is very, very impressive, and you can see that the problem is more deeply than to talk about just NAFTA, than to talk about just free trade. I need to hurry up because I'm afraid about the time. Well, I want that you see these main gaps about the NAFTA economic partners. And you can see here, well, I want to let you look, for example, of course, the rate of poverty, and of course, the income distribution concentration, or, for example, the public debt, or the public deficit, or the domestic financing. You see 37% of GDP against this other data of Canada and United States. And of course, the public expenditure per capita, it is a huge gap. And really, I think that if we want to do something about to discuss the NAFTA, we need to create the mechanism, the institution to face this that. Because as Cedillo said yesterday, all these are handmade process. All the policies are handmade process. It is a decision results and not a destiny. Let me show you the next. What failed would we negotiate the NAFTA agreement? Well, we fail in understanding the huge gaps on development that we have between Mexico and the other two countries. What are the main lessons? Well, the main lesson is that the financial and trade openness are not the main way to go to the convergence. And finally, if we want really to create some kind of path together or some commitments for convergence, we need to take in account on another topics in public policy and not only financial and trade openness. What happened before NAFTA? Well, 2 or 3 years before NAFTA, the Mexican government at that time with Ernesto Cedillo starting to change a lot of institutions in order to be ready for the NAFTA agreement. And one of those changes, institutional changes, was, of course, the financial reforms, and the financial reforms that include the privatization of the banks, that you remember, because the banks were nationalized in 1982 with the financial crisis. Then that privatization of the banks, and also the almost disappeared the public banks, create a lot of problems of financing. And of course, first one, a bubble of credit that becomes a crisis at the beginning of the 1995. And of course, the destruction of the public banks create a very low support, very weak support for the banking rescue during the banking crisis in that moment. And of course, the other policies that were started with the President Salinas for prepare the Mexican economy and the Mexican institution for the NAFTA were the public expenditure decentralization, and all of this create the basis of the financial liberalization that everybody knows that the financial liberalization, quite financial liberalization, have a crisis consequence. Even the IMF say that the financial opening create financial crisis. What means the independence of the central bank? Well, for Mexico means the prohibition of financing to the central government since the central bank. That means no public deficit. The impossibility to support the counter-cyclical policy with of course, when we have prolonged stagnation. Of course, growing financing of foreign financing, especially from the funds, but of course for the banks too. What kind of financial policy we have after the birth of the NAFTA bird? Well, the continue of public expenditure decentralization. That means growing local government debt. That means that the same thing that you have here in the United States, a lot of cities and a lot of states with a huge debt and also with a crisis. The privatization of Social Security, that means the same thing that you have now, huge losses in the Social Security funds, and especially the pension funds, no? And fiscal responsibility law that was approved until 2006, but it was really practices since 1993. And in the last 15 years or so, the securitization in energy, commodities, and all the public services. That means, well, a huge, very important position of the investment funds in the ownership and the profits of all these assets, in Mexico assets. The financial and fiscal policy after the NAFTA birthday means that Mexico cannot practice any kind of capital control. Therefore, when we have a crisis, the only instrument of monetary policy is the interest rates. Then the interest rates grows, and of course the huge growth of the interest rates means the bankruptcy of households, like in the United States happened very recently, and of course the bankruptcy of firms and even the bankruptcy of banks as we have in 1995. The zero public deficit also represents zero countercyclical policies. And of course, that means a virtual paralysis of the source of domestic financing that we have until present date. And then I want that you see these gaps that we have here. This is Mexico, domestic credit to the private sector. And it's easy to see that the Mexican domestic credit to the private sector are not growing. And the gap, really the gap in terms of the GDP is one of the main sources of not only of stagnation, but also of the reason that we don't have jobs, local jobs, most of the reason of the migration, etc., etc. This is the general government expenditure per capita in terms of PPP dollars. The general government expenditure per capita by population. And you can see this gap. Of course, this gap is all the ruin of all the social policy that you want to, if you want to have social policies. The government don't have the expenditure, the level of expenditure that it needs for grow the social policies. And this is the domestic expenditure, the domestic investment per capita also in PP dollars, and you see that in Mexico is growing, but not close the gap, even open the gap with the NAFTA, the domestic investment. The gap is growing. Well, and this is the general structural balance, that means the deficits of the governments, of the three governments, in per capita PP dollars. And you can see that this is United States that have a growing deficit, but Mexico that have a very, very small deficit like this. This gap is a problem that really create that the impossibility to have social policies, to have employment policies, etc., in Mexico, and that create all the problems that we now are looking very linked with the NAFTA, but those are problems that link it, that because the virtual paralysis of the main financing sources of the Mexican economy. Well, we have economic warning signs like this. Mexico have a huge amount of portfolio investment in Mexican market, that it is not, this is the data to 2012, but right now it is very similar that 2030 is very similar level, have a very similar level. Then we are in very, how do you say, all the symptoms of that we have in 1994 when we have a financial crisis. Of course, I'm not saying that we are going right now to a financial crisis, no, but we have most of those symptoms that we have in those days. I'm looking for a cartoon for you, but was very difficult to have a cartoon just for close my presentations. But I found this cartoon. I don't know if you like it, and this is an advertising. Yes, if you want to, you can look our journal. It's in Spanish and it's free. Thank you.
I will present you a different story. I will argue that there's been convergence in the well-being of North Americans, and I certainly will show you evidence of this. I'm going to use the Human Development Index of the UN, of the United Nations, and I will show you that especially on educational grounds and on health grounds, there's convergence, and you will see that in the last 20 years, and not necessarily because of NAFTA, Mexicans are enjoying a better quality of living, better standards of education, and better standards of health, especially much more coverage. And on that sense, there's convergence within North America in the last 20 years. So let me show you some of that data. I mean, I'm thrilled to be in Austin, even though we're catching here the only 3 or 4 very cold days of the winter, but it doesn't matter. I mean, this is always home for Patricia and me. And why to use the Human Development Index? Well, I believe it is important. I mean, it's always very difficult, and Jamie knows this very well, to isolate, I mean, or to assess how much NAFTA has affected jobs, salaries, and the well-being of people. And that's why I decided to go for this Human Development Report. I've been working for the UN for the last 2 years. I coordinated the Human Development Report for Latin America for the last year and this year, and so I have become acquainted with this index, and seems to me that helps us to show something, and something that goes beyond pure economic indicators, and at least it uses educational and health indicators. It helps, and this is useful, it helps to make comparisons among countries, and I'll tell you, especially the authorities of social policy, they're eager to see this report because they will tell, I mean, how much they advance in terms of world indexes. I mean, this is the way they do the Human Development Index. They use 3 dimensions: health, which is long and healthy life, education, and standard of living. On their standard of living is where we're going to have the per capita gross national income. And in education, they're going to use 2 measures: mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling, and that will give you the education index. And in terms of health, it's basically life expectancy at birth, and that will give you a number, which is the health index. This is the index for Mexico. I mean, this is the growth since the 1980s, but let me show you a graph because the number in itself wouldn't tell you much. This will tell you, for example, how the Mexican Human Development Index has grown in comparison to Cuba or to Uruguay. And as you can tell, nowadays Mexico, it's considered a country with high Human Development Index, and but this gives you a sense how it's in comparison to Cuba and to Uruguay. Now, this is not human development, this is only Mexico's poverty rate, but I wanted to show this because this will, I mean, what this is telling you is that basically we have a big problem in 1994, a huge shock in 1994, and just 20 years after, we're coming back to the pre-94 levels in terms of poverty. This is official data. Well, in this, NAFTA appears to have, of course, very little effect. This is the Human Development Index. This is the UN index. This is showing education and health and income. And as you can tell, I mean, there's very sharp differences within the states. Chiapas, which is still the poorest state in Mexico, in southeast Mexico, as you can tell, it continues to have a very low Human Development Index. Mexico City is very high, is the highest one in Mexico, and you will see that it's as high as almost as Norway, which is the country in the world with the highest Human Development Index. And you'll see and there's a big difference between Nuevo León and the national one as well. So this is interesting to note because this is telling you that during the last 20 years, if you look by states, I mean the improvement of this Human Development Index, you will see that there continues to be sharp differences among Mexican states, and Chiapas and Guerrero and some others, they still lagging behind. This is telling us that only 8 out of the 32 federal entities are in medium, high development indexes. 23 are high, and that is the measure of Mexico City as a nation. And Mexico City has these very high levels. And here we have also by health and by income, and as you can tell, in health is when we really have the most important advances. This is the Human Development Index. This is the comparison between Mexico, Canada, and the US. And as you see, there's some convergence. Not completely, but you can tell that the growth rate of Mexico has been greater than those of Canada and the US. And this is explained again, and I'll show you, I will decompose this. This is explained by education and health. This is income. In income, we continue to lag behind. I mean, this is the sad story of the last 20 years. And but here you will see health. In health, we'll see a complete convergence between North Americans. And of course, Canada continues to be, I mean, it is the only country, and let me stop here a little bit. Canada is the only country with universal coverage in North America. The US continued to have about 45 million people without insurance, without coverage, and which is about 15% of the population. And Mexico now has about 15%, about 20 million Mexicans without coverage. I mean, what is the story behind this in the Mexican health system? Well, it's very straightforward. I will say what we have done, what we have achieved in the last 10, 15 years is wonderful, and which is about 92% of Mexicans, 92 million Mexicans out of 112 billion Mexicans, they cover. About 40 million Mexicans they cover by Seguro Social. I mean, this is the employed Mexicans, the formally employed Mexicans, they have this very good coverage, either private or public, but they very well covered. Then, and this is the single most important achievement of the last decade, we have 52 million Mexicans covered by Seguro Popular, which is easy to say, but it was very difficult to do, and I would say it's a very important success of Mexico. And but let me give you a sense. I mean, this is, they cover, they have. They not fully cover it. It's an individual coverage, Seguro Popular is not a family coverage, and it's only they only cover for primary care, not special care, and I will say, for example, cancer. Seguro Popular only covers the most popular form of cancers, like prostate, which is very popular on men, and breast for women, but other types of cancer, the not very popular ones, they're not covered by Seguro Popular. For example, kidney failure, which is very popular in Mexico because of the rates of obesity. It's not covered by Seguro Popular. So there's an important coverage, but still, I will say, in terms of quality, there's a room to improve in Mexico. But here, what we have to say, I mean, this is evidence of convergence between North Americans on health issues. On education, there's also an important, I would say, convergence. What is the story here of Mexico? What is what Mexico has accomplished in terms of education in the last 20 years? I would say it's about coverage. 100% of Mexican children going to elementary school. There's universal elementary schooling for Mexican children. And this is very important because it doesn't matter how poor you are, there's going to be an elementary school wherever you are. And this is important. There's 95%, or close to 95% of Mexicans go to middle school. This is very important. And it's coming very close to be universal. And I would say only 2 out of 3 Mexicans are going to high school. And what the goal for the next 10 years is to have universal coverage that every single Mexican youngster in age to go to high school, they should be in high school. And we have 1 out of 3 Mexicans going in the age for going to college, they're going to college. And the goal for the next 50 years is to have 50% of Mexicans at the age of going to college to attend college. What I'm telling you here is that in terms of coverage, we have made huge advances, very important advances, but we still have problems in the quality of education. That is the big if in Mexico, but that is a big if everywhere. I will put it that way. So that is the big challenge for Mexico, I mean, how to improve the quality of education. And it's not going to be that easy. I'm somewhat optimistic. Last year, we finally have education reform. And education reform, I mean, a man, an official that I trust, Rodolfo Tuirán, he was just telling me 2 days ago, I asked him, Rodolfo, I mean, he's a graduate from UT, from the sociology department, and I told Rodolfo, what is what I could tell that we have achieved with education reform? And he told me, it's very simple, Rafael. Finally, because of education reform, we, the government, we, the officials, are going to be able to do the programs, to be in charge of the programming of the schools, of hiring the professors, he told me. 2 years ago, I was meeting like once a week with the union. Now, I don't really have to meet with them. I could meet with them every other 2 months. So finally, it's the state, the government recuperating prerogatives in terms of education policy, and seems to me that that is very important. If you were asked to me, I believe that NAFTA has been wonderful, not only because, as Cedillo was saying yesterday, NAFTA has been wonderful, excellent, I would say, to improve trade and investment between the North American partners. It's been a tremendous success. But also NAFTA had very positive spillovers into other areas of the bilateral relationship. I believe, for example, Mexican diplomacy was benefited a lot by NAFTA because, and really it is because of NAFTA, now Mexicans are playing the Washington game. They know where to go. They know how to lobby Congress. And that NAFTA was wonderful for the US-Mexico bilateral relationship. But if you were going to ask me, has NAFTA has any important spillovers in the health realm and in the education realm, I would say not really. Mexico, for example, we Mexicans continue to lag behind China or India. We're not, I would say, taking advantage of being next door to the best university system. And now Mexico is the 9th country in sending students to US universities. There's only 14,000 Mexicans in US universities, and you have close to 200,000 Chinese, and you have you have 80,000 Koreans, and Korea is 1/4 in terms of the population in comparison to Mexico. And on health matters, I mean, there's a lot of room to improvement. Basically, and this is something that Mr. Frank, who was President Fox's health minister, he explained it to me, and actually he explained it to President Calderon. Basically, the U.S. is undergoing a very important revolution in its health system, and the goal is to attain universal coverage. Mexico is also doing this important reform, and the goal is universal coverage. And we're talking very little to each other. We're complemented very little to each other, and there's a lot of room to improve. Thank you very much.
Well, we've had 3 excellent presentations. I think we'll all agree to that. Now it's time for you as the audience to, after reflecting on them, to pose questions. And I will take a number of questions, and then we'll ask our distinguished panelists to respond. So please use the microphone, raise your hands, and let's spend about 10 minutes, maybe 15, to continue to probe the issue of equality, inequality, convergence. Do we have any volunteers?
Thank you very much to all the presenters. I congratulate you on the presentations. I have one general comment. I think that the important piece that is missing, and I would like to hear comments from all of them, is the causality between the data and NAFTA. I think that continues to be a challenge. I was particularly struck by the presentation of Eugenia Correa. It shows very, very alarming figures. I could not, name them in any other way, but there is absolutely no comments on the causality. What is the linkage between this reduced or low level of public expenditure with NAFTA? What is the level of a high level or a low level of domestic investment and NAFTA? I think that I would love to hear more on the part of the 3 presenters, and at the same time, I'm certainly on Rafael's camp in the sense that NAFTA has produced very important positive effects for Mexico, and that there is some convergence. But also, I think that we're not able to really identify the linkages specifically with the trade agreement and those data. And I think that, as a research agenda is important for the future. And I would like to ask also very briefly, Dr. Correa, if the expenditure data is corrected, for example, from defense spending. I think that you would get a completely different picture if you correct for defense spending, especially during the last years. If you correct from levels of government, and I think that it just shows a picture that is not really accurate in that regard. Also, do you have any opinion in terms of how to correct, for example, that it is alarming to have such low levels of financing in the 3 countries, but how can you correct for the difference in the structure of the financial systems that are not necessarily linked to the North American Free Trade Agreement? So what would you do to correct the data in a way that can actually show a more accurate picture? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Causality, defense spending, financial system. Next question.
This is something of an observation relative to Rafael's comments, but connecting those comments to the previous session. Is this on? Hello. Okay. Convergence in health. One of the most unfortunate aspects of what's going on in the United States right now with healthcare reform is the fact that it doesn't cover the undocumented population. And so you have the sort of tragedy, or whatever the word is, of large fractions of the Mexican origin population in the United States with much worse access to health care in this country than they would have in Mexico. You have contrasting policies in different respects. My area is reproductive health, and we have the situation of people here in Austin who will travel to Mexico to get an IUD for free that they can't get in clinics here in the city. So the expansion and successes of coverage of relatively long standing in Mexico make the situation in the United States look worse and worse. And what's also very hard to come to terms with is how little people in the United States know, including well-placed officials and academics and so forth, about the contrast that exists for these two populations, depending on, for this one population, depending on which side of the border they're on. So I think there's a lot of education that could happen. Thanks.
Thank you. The irony and contradiction of poor health care in Texas compared to crossing the border to Mexico, ignorance of officials. Is there another question or comment? Very good. Let's go to the questions that have been posed. Each of our distinguished guests, I sense that one of the comments questions is directed individually to each, and so I'm going to ask Jamie to start off, and I think perhaps you can address, among others, if you wish, the causality question.
Well, I detect that my little diagrams had the desired effect, which was to intimidate the audience into a kind of cowed silence. In assembling this information, it was not our purpose to try to dig out a causal effect of a trade agreement which will in any event operate cumulatively and over time on some other economic time series. Just very, it's not, I think, an appropriate way of proceeding. What one has observed, and it emerges very clearly from the kind of descriptive analysis and qualitative history that was we heard this morning, was that NAFTA had very important specific effects on the relationship between Mexico and its North American neighbors, and specifically on the agricultural sector, on the migratory population. There was then the further, as Doug Massey laid out, the further effect on the U.S. border policy. And all of these things can be treated as part of a cumulative sequence, which makes the question of specific causation, I think, a rather unfruitful one. It would be very hard to know if NAFTA had been rejected rather than approved, how the world would be different, or whether certainly some of the changes that were attributed to NAFTA, for example, integration of the manufacturing sector, were going on already under the Maquiladora programs, and would perhaps have found other ways of continuing. So what I did was to present a body of information and to try and draw some sort of summary facts from it, rather than to indulge in the, if we hadn't done X, the world would be fundamentally different, which is something I find very difficult to believe.
Thank you. Eugenia.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm pretty sure that it is difficult to find a lot of direct causality between so many phenomena. You see, in medicine, for example, it takes just 20 years to exactly explain the form in which so kind of medicine start cancer or I don't know, other things like that produce cancer, and it is very difficult really to arrive really, not 20 years, even more. In social science and especially in economics, we don't have this kind of relation, directly relation, that we want to find many times. But if you see the figures that I present here, most of the figures are, especially the charts figures, comes from the IMF directly, the data. Well, I try to explain that those figures could be explained by policies, by decisions of the authorities, of the different authorities, of the different participants of the market in Mexico, of course in Mexico, and first ones in Mexico, and second one in other countries. And that's why I refer the words of Presidente Seguido yesterday that say, policies are decisions, are not destiny. Then second one, the figures about correct the figures that you proposed, someone proposed me, the correct the figures about defense. Well, yes, if I rest the defense of the figures of the expenditure per capita here in the United States could be more precisely, could be more precisely if I reduce also, for example, the payment of, the interest payment of the Mexican government in the figures of the expenditure of the expenditure that I present. I can arrive so many different measures of public expenditure, but I want to show the global gap existed. You know, I can, yes, of course, I can take different data or different reductions or additions or whatever, but I need to show the gap, and the gap. I think that it will be very, it was very evident in the data. Second one, the domestic financial system. Well, the domestic financial credit that we have to the private sector, it's very low. It's very, very low, and have at least three reasons. First one, when we finished the crisis of 1985, the solvency of the local firms and household was very, very low. Second one, the main competition of the local banks are precisely right now the foreign quarters of the foreign headquarters of those banks. Even I remember very well when I started a conversation with the Citibank in Mexico, the president of the Citibank in Mexico, he explained us that his main competition of give loans in Mexico are not the other banks in Mexico, are precisely the foreign banks, and especially their own earthquakes in New York. Then the other thing that explained, 1 minute, please. The last thing that explained the stagnation of the domestic financing is that the banks are in the new business model. And the new business model of the banks right now is the security and is the derivatives. And if you see all the balance of the banks in Mexico, you can see that everybody are in that business and not in the business to make loans to the local firms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenia.
Thank you, very brief. Thank you, Joe, for your comment. I will say that the paisano, the potential migrant in Mexico, she usually does a cost-benefit analysis, and it's not only about wages. It's also about educational opportunities, about health coverage, and seems to me that is retiring. I mean, the fact that now there's better services in Mexico, and for the undocumented people, there's no services whatsoever here for undocumented migrants, that is deterring Mexicans from coming. And seems to me that also healthcare issues is a factor in explaining the return migration. We don't have yet the evidence, we don't have the numbers, but it's crystal clear that, I mean, if you're sick in the US and you don't have documents, you better go back to Mexico. And there's no question on that. To conclude, let me share with you an anecdote that President Calderon placed a call to President Obama. When Obama got his most important success of his presidency, when the Healthcare Act was approved by Congress, and so Calderon told him basically, congratulations, Obama. I mean, now we're going to have a more fair USA, and President Calderon, who was, I mean, he's very keen on healthcare services. I mean, he was truly happy for this, and he told him, and he truly congratulated Obama. And then Obama told him back, by the way, Felipe, I gotta tell you something. I'm very worried about this because undocumented Mexicans, they will not be covered by the Obama healthcare. So there's a problem here, and but although I mean, it is fascinating to observe this year, I mean, as an observer, if whether Obamacare is going to function or not. Seems to me that the numbers are better than what they say, but it's interesting to see the divide here. I mean, the political divide, and how the conservatives, they just hate Obamacare, and on the other hand, seems to me that this is a system that could improve the quality of living of Americans. But I don't want to comment.
Can I just offer a final observation? This is something which strikes me as of real importance. That a number of times the question has been raised, what is the most important project for moving forward over the next 20 years? And some aspects of that project are definitely political. It's my understanding that President Calderon represented the conservative end of the Mexican political spectrum. I think that's a fair observation. It seems to me that one of the most useful things that could be done would be to integrate those Mexican conservatives into the modern Republican Party in the United States. It would be just a tremendous thing.
Okay, now here in Texas, we do not use multiple choice tests, but we're going to put our panel on the spot here because our question here was, has NAFTA led to more inequality or more equality? And I would just take Mexico. There are three choices to this multiple choice question. Has NAFTA been positive for equality in Mexico? Has NAFTA been negative for equality in Mexico? Or we don't know for sure? Let me ask you, Professor Galbraith, to first answer this question that you would never propose to your own students.
Well, Peter, I have to say, I'm not sure what your ethnic antecedents are, but mine are Scottish. And this is very important because in Scotland, uniquely amongst the judicial systems of the world, we have a third verdict, which is called not proven. That's called the Scotch verdict, and I rest on it.
Okay.
Let me say just that we really have here right now a very extravagant convergence. That means inequality of the three countries in trends, and of course, a very strange convergence in stagnation, in low growth. Thank you.
I will say that we academics, we have really failed in doing more research on this, and we don't know yet, I mean, how much NAFTA has really affected these areas of well-being, I'll put it that way.
So we have three answers. As far as I can take it, we don't know for sure. Thank you very much.